I and this group of investigators are interested ultimately in the neuromechanics of locomotion in sea stars. This project is focused on the mechanics of individual tube feet which achieve the locomotion of sea stars. So what we see here is an example of one species of sea star coordinating the action of hundreds of tube feet to propel the animal towards the left. What we've realized in the course of our investigations of locomotion is that a lot is not understood about the mechanics of hydrostatic skeletons. And so we have some fundamental biomechanical questions that we would like to address. First of all, what are the dominant forces in locomotion? What loads need to be overcome by these tube feet? Second, what is the mechanical advantage of tube feet? We've come to realize that there is no mechanical advantage definition for any hydrostatic system, including these. And finally, once we have a handle on mechanical advantage, let's apply that tool to look at variation in morphology. So for example, what are the differences in terms of force transmission between the proximal and distal feet in the body of a single sea star? So we see, for example, here, these distal feet are very slight and elongated and don't participate much in generating propulsive forces, whereas the proximal feet are much larger and are quite involved in locomotion. Now, we can get a sense for the anatomy of tube feet by looking at a histological section. The podium is the part that sticks out and is visible in that movie that I just showed you. It has these pink stained longitudinal muscles which serve to retract the tube foot, and at the distal end are lots of cell bodies where there are plenty of sensory cells. In the middle is a lumen which contains fluid that runs continuously with this muscularized bladder on the interior of the body that's known as the ampulla. So in this animation, I'll show you how the basic parts work and how the muscle layers operate. Here we have the ampulla. The muscle lining, when it contracts, fills up the podium, which drives extension. That's reversed by the longitudinal muscles. And both chambers are wrapped in very stiff fibers that are helically wound in the case of the podium. Now, we've decided to focus on sea stars that have a relatively few number of tube feet in order to more easily model the mechanics of their locomotion. So here we have, for the Leptosteria species, one adult surrounded by lots of little juveniles, and you can see from this SEM that there are about a dozen tube feet. There are 6 pairs of tube feet on each arm, which is a relatively modest number. And these animals are pretty darn cute. So we performed 3D kinematics experiments where we measured manually the positioning of tube feet, and we combined that with morphometrics from histological sections, which we incorporated into our modeling. Now, the 3D kinematics were possible because we simultaneously recorded the motion of the body from the side, and we used their red eye spots as landmarks. You can see one in the center there. So for addressing the first question, what are the dominant forces, we took measurements of the body motion and evaluated the inertial forces, that is just the acceleration times the mass of the body, and compared that to the fluid forces and the submerged weight. And what we see here is an example of one trace of the inertial forces of the body. So mass times the acceleration of the body gives us that estimate for the inertial force. This is a log scale of the body forces, and we can see that the submerged weight is much higher. In fact, it's over 1,000 times greater than the inertial force, and drag is a much smaller force. Now, we also ran experiments with the animals upside down and estimated the forces for both right side up and upside down, that is the individual forces generated by the tube feet, if submerged weight is the dominant force. And from that analysis, that's the upside down movie, from that analysis we see very similar forces whether they're inverted or horizontal. So they use a similar number of tube feet, and the forces that are generated by the tube feet are similar in both orientations. So in answer to what are the dominant forces, we know that the submerged weight very much dominates, and that pushing and pulling forces are comparable in magnitude. Okay, what about the mechanical advantage? Well, we're used to thinking about mechanical advantage in rigid lever systems. Where mechanical advantage is a measure of leverage, it's specifically equal to the output force per unit input force into the system, which works out to be a ratio of the in lever to out lever of the system. And the mechanical advantage is perfectly inversely proportional to the displacement advantage, dA. And the bottom line here is that you get more displacement for a system that has poor leverage. And the same is true for engineered hydraulic systems, but the geometry is different. So here the mechanical advantage is equal to a ratio of areas, particularly the area of the plunger on the output end divided by the area of the input end. And again, there's an ideal or perfect inverse relationship between displacement and mechanical advantage. Now for tube feet, it turns out that the cross-sectional areas matter as well. And so we have the ampulla, and when its muscles contract, the cross-section of the ampular space provides that input area. And the contractions of those muscles serve to pressurize the fluid on their interior, and that pressure is felt throughout the lumen of the podium as well, including on the output end, which is where we generate the output force. So we have this component of the geometry just like in an engineered system. However, by collaborating with Olaf Ehlers, he finally convinced me that there's more to it than just these cross-sectional areas. In fact, the helical winding around the tube foot plays a role and offers a source of internal resistance to the output force. And what happens here is that the radial expansion due to the pressure along the length of the podium creates tension within the fibers, and then those fibers have a component that acts in opposition to the output force. So if we have theta be the pitch angle of the helical winding down its length, then we have this expression here that quantifies that internal resistance. And again, displacement advantage is inversely proportional to the mechanical advantage. Now this system has some pretty neat properties, which we can evaluate here. As the ampulla extends, look what happens to the podium towards the end. You can see that there's a little jump in displacement. Now that occurs despite the fact that in this simulation I have assumed a constant strain of the muscles in the ampulla. The radius is decreasing at a constant rate, but the podium is extending at an unsteady rate, and there's an acceleration towards the end. And we can understand that by considering the geometry. So what we have down here is the volume within the podium as a function of the pitch angle of that helical winding, and you can see that it follows a nonlinear relationship. Now the volume of fluid is shown by the horizontal line here, and that increases as the ampulla adds fluid to the podium. And so you can see that as it rises up, that it follows that nonlinear trajectory, and at its near the maximum volume, you get a greater decrease in the pitch angle per unit increase in volume up there than at the beginning. And as a consequence, here we have the displacement advantage. We see that the displacement advantage increases dramatically close to full extension, and at the same time we have a dropping off in the mechanical advantage due to the internal resistance for the fibers and decrease in the output area. So the bottom line here is that tube feet move with variable gearing that favors high force at short extensions and high displacement at longer extensions. Okay, so now that we have this tool of the mechanical advantage in hand, let's see how it applies to these juvenile sea stars. So what we have here is an example of a gate diagram of the tube feet in one of our experiments. And all that I want you to know here is that there are lots of blue bars, and that corresponds to the most proximal feet being used with high frequency and locomotion. When we do that for repeated recordings, we see that both for horizontal and inverted locomotion, it is the proximal feet that are used most frequently. When we performed our morphometrics and used those as inputs to mechanical advantage, then we saw that the maximum mechanical advantage here decreases among the tube feet from the most proximal, which is tube foot 1, to the most distal, and we have an exact inverse effect of the displacement advantage. Now here, since we don't know the fluid volume in each tube foot from histology, we just evaluated both MA and DA at a variety of volumes. So the higher volumes are the more yellowish colors. So we found that proximal feet are used more frequently and they have a higher mechanical advantage and therefore a greater capacity to generate high force. So in response to our 3 questions of interest, what are the dominant forces? We found that the submerged weight is dominant. We now have an expression for the mechanical advantage of tube feet. And finally, we can use that to evaluate the proximal feet, and we find that they're more capable of generating high force. Now, we're interested in taking this understanding, this framework, and applying it to adults such as we see here. And we started on this in this past summer. In collaboration with Amy Johnson and Olaf Ehlers, we developed an optical force plate, which is going to allow us to directly measure the forces generated by individual tube feet, such as this one here on the force plate. And we've already gotten some very exciting preliminary results with this device. And just to offer a plug, Amy Johnson is going to be presenting her work at this session shown here. Thank you very much.